Hi.
That's the danger we face. Remember when I said you have to think about security differently? It's not just tanks.
And again, my greetings for the second panel. Thank you very much for coming. We have our new speakers here, and we will discuss very important issues which comes to cyber information and all related issues to its security. But for the moment, we are having our keynote speaker from NATO, Jacqueline Doe, who is the head of Western Section of Security Policy Department. We are ready to listen to her. She will be online. Hello, Jacqueline. Unfortunately, and also our panel members will be joining us online. And I will introduce them when the time comes. But first, we start with Ms. Doe.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we do.
Yeah, okay, good. Thank you. And good morning or good afternoon, I guess, your time. And apologies, first of all, because I think you were expecting the special representative of the Secretary General for the Caucasus. I'm afraid Javier Colomina was called away unexpectedly, and you've got me instead, so apologies. As you said, I'm the head of the Partnership West team in the Political Affairs Security Policy Division, and that includes our partners in the South Caucasus, of course, Georgia. I'm going to deliver Javier's speech. We're going to talk about resilience. And let me start by thanking the University of Georgia School of Social Sciences and the University of Georgia Security Platform for organizing the event, as well as the expert panelists, some of whose names I do recognize, present to discuss the various aspects of resilience and related issues. Georgia was arguably the first country to experience a combined conventional and cyber attack in 2008. And in the wake of that attack, Georgia's had to ask itself hard questions about vulnerabilities and resilience. Over the years, you've experienced misinformation campaigns and you've endured economic boycotts. You've had to build or rebuild critical infrastructure, and you've had to think through how to protect these assets. And of course, you face the very specific challenges you have in the occupied territories: passportization, borderization, human rights issues, and more recently, like the rest of the world, how best to respond to a pandemic. Now, for NATO, this is also arguably a familiar topic, because the 1949 Washington Treaty already stipulated that the parties, and I quote, separately and jointly, by means of continuous and effective self-help and mutual aid, will maintain and develop their individual and collective capacity to resist armed attack. And, end quote. Under this umbrella, NATO has, since the 1950s, developed many policies, set up many structures, and conducted many activities to address emergencies and to ensure preparedness. In fact, we've even built our own pipeline system. This work, of course, took a new direction following the end of the Cold War in the early 90s, when NATO started to engage extensively with its partners in this area, and we created a body to coordinate the use of civilian and military assets from allies and partners, including at the time Russia, in response to disasters, whether man-made or natural. And this resulted in the setting up of the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Response Coordination Center, which is a bit of a mouthful, which we still have today, the EADRCC. But since then, since the 90s, our societies have become increasingly complex and interdependent, and new vulnerabilities have emerged. And in addition, today's strategic and security environment has become one of increased competition. So arguably, hybrid threats are no longer just elements of our competition. They are today's competition, or even coercion, and sometimes even confrontation, which means that resilience and preparedness has become ever more crucial to maintaining our individual and collective capacity to absorb and resist attacks. Indeed, resilience is one of the key issues that NATO is hoping to address when we develop our new strategic concept later this year. So clearly, the topic of resilience, and indeed this conference today, is a very timely one. But it's also an issue, excuse me, around which there's some confusion and misunderstanding. Resilience is a broad concept. It means different things to different audiences, and is often mistakenly presented as a fashionable synonym for crisis management and recovery. Now, at NATO, when we talk about resilience, we mean the national and collective ability to absorb strategic shocks, whilst ensuring the three core functions of continuity of government, continuity of essential services to the population, and ability to support military operations. Resilience is an essential basis, therefore, for a credible deterrence and defense. And this also means, as I've said before, that whereas it's primarily a national responsibility, it is also a collective commitment. And in this context, NATO takes an all hazards, whole of government and whole of society approach to resilience. And we do place significant emphasis on helping to increase allies' preparedness for crisis, rather than focusing only on managing the consequences of crises. At present, at the headquarters around NATO, we are taking concrete new steps to improve our own resilience and that of our allies. Excuse me. This includes a broader and more coordinated approach, and we're trying to achieve this through the establishment, the assessment, and the monitoring of resilience objectives and national goals, through the establishment of a senior resilience committee, which will actually replace the existing civil emergency planning committee, and the designation of senior national officials by allies to coordinate efforts on the national level and to enhance and streamline consultations within NATO. So that's a bit about resilience broadly and how we look at it. If I can now turn to NATO's engagement with partners in this area, and the specific case of Georgia, which is of course one of NATO's closest partners. As I've said, because we live in an integrated and interdependent environment, the resilience of our close partners is in many ways as important as our own resilience. And the new Resilience Committee will engage with partners such as Georgia, which are facing similar challenges. And the aim will be to exchange experience, best practices, and methodologies among allies and partners. But in fact, a lot of work on resilience has already been done within the NATO-Georgia partnership, especially since 2008. Several NATO advisory support teams have traveled to Georgia to engage with Georgian counterparts on a peer-to-peer basis. And together we've worked on a national concept for critical infrastructure protection, and we've promoted a whole-of-government approach to resilience and national security. Since 2018, we've shared with Georgia the same resilience questionnaire that allies use to self-assess their state of resilience and civil preparedness in the context of the NATO defense planning process. And Georgia is one of the selected partners with whom allies engage on a regular dialogue on resilience in the Civil Emergency Planning Committee. Today and in the future, therefore, NATO will continue to support Georgia's resilience using all available tools and opportunities. And one of the 7 strategic objectives of the substantial NATO-Georgia package is to enhance Georgia's resilience. And in fact, nearly all of its 16 initiatives contribute to resilience in one way or another, whether it be STRATCOM, cyber defense, crisis management, or military medicine. And finally, if I may, on a more political note, Georgia's ability to absorb strategic shocks is also dependent on Georgia's ability to implement broader key reforms. And only last week here at headquarters, allies and Georgia discussed these reforms in the context of Georgia's annual national program. And allies highlighted a few areas with which you are probably familiar. The need to overcome the impasse between opposition and government parties, which distracts from the reforms, from progress on judiciary reform, from accountability of the security services, and also from the electoral reforms and media freedoms which are needed. We have also encouraged Georgia to make best use of its National Security Council as a body that can promote a whole-of-government approach. We hope to see a renewed dynamic in the reform process in Georgia, as these are all reforms that are in the interest of Georgian citizens. They help prepare Georgia on its path to Euro-Atlantic integration, and to return to the topic of today's event, they enhance Georgia's resilience and thus its deterrence and defense. In conclusion, let me say that we firmly believe here at NATO that there is no security without resilience and no resilience without partnerships. So events like this one today are of tremendous importance in deepening our connection and our cooperation. The broad, open dialogue and the exchange of views they offer do help to shape the way forward for all of us towards a more resilient and hopefully a more secure future. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dell, for your comprehensive analysis, and it was really great to hear that this year the new strategic concept is coming, and the resilience will be one of the key issues there. The resilience that we need nowadays, the NATO partner and aspirant countries, is like to strengthen our internal politics, internal affairs, in a vision that we can come closer to the alliance in terms of securing our borders and our political life and everyday life of our citizens. Therefore, we would be great that this new strategic concept will cover all these issues. Therefore, our governments will be able to copy and paste something from it into their everyday affairs. Thank you very much, and it was really nice to hear and listen to you. And now we will go to our panel, which is also very interesting. It covers information and cyber issues, and we know that some countries are using these possibilities in a good or bad way, and mainly it is applicable in a bad way because they are affecting big and Nad'a Kovalcikova, Senior Analyst, EU Institute for Security Studies, who will provide us with the EU perspective regarding the ongoing issues on cyber and information. You are welcome, Nad'a.
Thank you, Konstantine, and good early afternoon to everyone. Good morning from Paris. I hope you hear me well. So it's a pleasure to be here at the conference, and after such a insightful and informative keynote we heard from the NATO representative, I will be just happy to follow under and focus a little bit more, zoom in on the information operations and perhaps cyber as well, but I do know that other colleagues in the panel will focus more perhaps on the cyber elements. So I'll start with the information sphere, and more particularly with information manipulation. So just to clarify, from the very beginning of our session, we do know a lot of the different definitions that refer to information manipulation. Some use disinformation, misinformation, propaganda, and other types of terminologies. In my approach, I will focus more on the definition of information manipulation. And so what do I mean by that? So looking at mostly the intentional and often covered use of media that is manipulating public discourse, or it's used to manipulate public discourse to mislead or potentially cause harm. So this information manipulation can be encompassed in three main criteria. One of them is it's a coordinated campaign. That's kind of one of the criteria of information manipulation with the intention to cause harm. Second is diffusion of false or distorted information, or information that is suppressed is also information manipulation. So the fact that there is a lack of access to information or to credible, verifiable information is also a way to manipulate information. And the third one is the intention of political intention to cause harm. So with these three criteria, we could look at this information manipulation as a phenomenon to undermine either democracies or confuse people, divide different fragments of society, different countries, different organizations. So looking at information manipulation from this angle allows us to better understand also the context, geopolitical context of the issues that are, or the messages that are spread and amplified in the information space. And I think as for Georgia and many other countries now looking at the current tensions, also between Russia and Ukraine, we can look at very concrete narratives, for example, that have been spread in the last days, weeks, but actually even months and years. So from the EU perspective, EU has established this portal called EU versus Disinfo. But when we do look at the manipulation of messaging coming especially from pro-Kremlin or Kremlin state or led media outlets, there have been actually over 13,500 cases already identified of these Russian messages that have been spread in the information sphere online. Out of these 30,500, almost or around 40% actually focused on Ukraine. So over 5,000 cases, which is an incredible amount. Also, an important part has been also looking and focusing on Georgia, but also on EU member states, on NATO and others. But it is interesting to see that as of 2015, around 40% actually of these cases did focus on Ukraine. What does it say? That this type of operations, influence operations in the cyberspace, in the public spheres, is not one-off event. It's not only shortly around certain type of crisis or elections, but it's a continuous process that is being built up that can be then further exploited in more critical moments. What are the two main narratives that might be perhaps of an interest to highlight? Revelation that is happening now in Ukraine. First, that Ukraine is being used by the West. This is one of the two key narratives that have been identified and cataloged, but also debunked by the EU thanks to this system and the database of the EU versus Disinfo. And with this narrative of Ukraine being used by the West, it was mostly discussed in the context of that Ukraine is a tool to influence and destabilize Russia. So we see how basically this phrasing and framing of these narratives were distorting the understanding of the situation on the ground and therefore confusing also different groups of people, the citizens, but also international picture and everyone who is having access and reading this type of messaging. Second narrative is that the West is about to run a false flag operation in order to trigger a direct clash with Russia. So again, a distorted, a manipulated narrative trying to bring this perception that it's the fault of the West, that Russia is just defending itself. It was also mentioned in NATO as being the creator of this confrontation, and that basically Russia needs to act because of all of this aggressive behavior of all the other actors, which again is a very interesting way to try to frame and influence the minds of everyone who is reading such messages. Why is this important? I think these concrete examples really allow us to better understand what is happening in the information space. Who are the actors online, especially over the social media? What exactly they are building on? Historical context, current dynamics, emotional aspects of these narratives are being usually highlighted, so people feel stronger about responding to them. And therefore, we need to really keep in mind this type of repetitive as well, and the strategies that evolve and the tools that are being used. However, information manipulation is only one part of a bigger package of tools that are usually being used in parallel. For example, cyber attacks many times do happen around the same time when there are increased efforts to influence the society, the citizens, different countries at the same time. There is also the use of malign finance or economic coercion with exploiting the vulnerabilities, also being the vulnerabilities of the critical infrastructure, for example. We have seen also in the current conflicts in relation to energy security, for example, but also other ways to try to do subversive operations of, for example, third actors in the process and stakeholders. So seeing this as part of a holistic toolkit is one way that we need to understand this from a broader context. Second, knowing that this is not happening as a one-time event every time, but many times it's a campaign or it's already built up from the past, and it's just adding to that or repeating and bringing those messages to the public sphere. And the third, that there are various actors, not only from the side of the interference, but also from the side of addressing these issues. EU is only one piece of this bigger puzzle. EU is trying to also develop different institutional capacities and build on. So perhaps just to mention what is and what has been EU doing so far. So in order to address information manipulation and the influence in these public spheres, EU has developed several task forces. For example, within the External Action Service, Strategic Communications Task Forces that are not only trying to analyze and catalog these information operations, these cases of false, distorted information, but also debunk them on a regular basis. There has been also hybrid fusion cell established. There have been joint frameworks on countering hybrid threats, but also on increasing resilience, as we have heard. The focus also coming from NATO. There is a European Center of Excellence for countering hybrid threats that also looks a lot and actually focuses really a lot of resources on information, on countering information manipulation, cyber attacks. But there are also many other initiatives that have been established in order to tailor different critical moments of our policy situations, such as different media literacy campaigns to counter disinformation. There has been also this special committee established in the European Parliament countering foreign interference in all democracies, including disinformation. Maybe just to add for this special committee that its mandate is now concluding shortly, that is going to publish a report which may be of an interest to some of you. The comprehensive amendments are already public, available, but the final report should be available soon. And this committee, especially as I mentioned before, also focused not only on disinformation or let's say information manipulation and the cyber operations, but also on these other aspects I had highlighted earlier of malign finance, how to counter that, or this economic coercion, but goes beyond Russia. So not only looking at Russia, but also discuss other actors such as China, other state actors as well, and non-state actors too. So I think it will be interesting to kind of understand and see what is the outcome of the discussions within the European Parliament as the representatives of the citizens of all the EU member states and different political parties have come together with this assessment and study the foreign interference in the democracies. This is important because a lot of the discussions did not only focus on interference in the EU member states, but also in other democracies, partner countries, neighboring countries, that might be definitely helpful to also see the results for Georgia, for Western Balkans, for other countries that have been also discussed and part of these efforts. So perhaps just to finish on the line of the resilience, as this has been very eloquently already discussed by the keynote speaker. So the way to look at the resilience also perhaps more also from the EU side, beyond what has been already said, is this ability of states and societies to reform, this is standing and recovering from internal and external crisis. And this ability, this flexibility, these capacities that are being built to be resilient, it's not the end of our efforts, it's just one of the means to really be able to sustain or to withstand the crises that are going to continue to rise. And I would like to finish on this resilience building on the partnerships. As was also mentioned, EU, as I said, it's only one piece of the bigger puzzle. It's thinking of a lot of proactive measures, not only responding, but also proactive ways to address information manipulation, how to build on the tools that are already existing, how to cooperate with the partners that are doing excellent work at various levels, being the state or non-state, stakeholders, academia, journalists, and others. And I think this type of ways of putting our strengths together and our efforts and with cooperating with the partners is the way how we can have a larger impact on addressing such interconnected threats as the information manipulation or cyber attacks are. Thank you.
Thank you, Nad'a, very much. It was really interesting to listen to you. And you raised a very good question about identifying who are the major actors and where we can identify whether it is state actor or it is some private individual or a group of private individuals who are trying to manipulate different areas and different layers of society, and also conducting cyber attacks on main infrastructure of different countries or different societies is really a very big challenge for us, because for many years, I would say it would be difficult to control and to sustain a controllable situation in this term. Maybe during our discussions we will find some solutions about it, or maybe not, but anyways, it was really very interesting to listen to you. And we will come back to you during the questions and answers period. Thank you very much. And now I would like to introduce Eto Buziashvili, fellow researcher at the Atlantic Digital Lab, who is a standing wall, I would say, in Georgia in front of these manipulative activities which are coming from identified and unidentified actors. So, Eto,
identified.
Please identify. Yeah.
We do know who they are. Thank you so
Okay.
much. It's my pleasure to be joining you today in this very important discussion. I'll start with one of my favorite tales, which is a tale of fox and turtle. So once there was a fox who wanted to eat the turtle, but every time he tried to do so, the turtle withdrew into its own shell. So fox tried many things. Fox tried to beat up the shell with a stick, but it did not help. Fox tried to suggest money in exchange of removing the shell, but it did not work as well. So one day there appeared the hanging TVs on the trees in the forest. And these TVs were advertising turtles without shells, how they were able to freely fly. And of course our turtle wanted to fly as well. But he also knew that if he had removed the shell, he would be eaten by the turtle. So one day, when the sky was bigger and clearer than usual, the turtle removed its own shell. And turtle did not know, and never will, because he was eaten by the fox, that information warfare is a purposeful training of an enemy on how to remove its own shell. Unfortunately, this tale is not mine. This is the very first and opening paragraph in the book by Russian military analyst Sergei Rastorgurov. And the title of the book is The Philosophy of Information Warfare, and the book was written back in 1998. This very first opening paragraph basically captures the whole notion of the information warfare and how Russia was viewing the information domain back in 90s or back in Soviet times. I will be focusing on Russia because Russia is the #1 national security threat for Georgia, and in the information domain we are observing more and more Russian information operations related to Russia. But the interesting thing is that it's not a new phenomenon. The information operations and disinformation was part of active measures implemented by Soviet Union many years ago. So there were many tools like penetration into churches, political assassinations, poisoning the opponents, and one of the tools of active measures was spreading disinformation and false narrative about the main enemy, which was the US. And there was an interesting operation conducted by the KGB. You might have heard about the Operation Infection or the AIDS disinformation campaign, when basically KGB blamed the US for artificially inventing AIDS virus and spreading into different countries. And this disinformation was on for many years, basically for 10 years, because this operation has started in 1983 and kind of finished in 1992 when the director of Foreign Intelligence Service admitted that this operation was conducted by the KGB. And why I'm talking about this operation? Because we are seeing the same playbook nowadays as well. But the main shift in the disinformation are basically two things. The first, that the spread of disinformation is very quick. Basically, we're one click away from being the targets of disinformation because of the internet. And the second thing is a very important one. If in the times of Soviet Union, the Soviet leadership tried to prove that their lie was a truth, like in the case of Operation Infection, now the modern Moscow is trying to undermine the notion of objective truth. It means that the narratives that we are observing are saying that there does not exist one truth, there does not exist one fact. Everybody has their own truth, and everybody can say what the fact is. And we are seeing many conflicting narratives, many conflicting disinformation narratives on one case. Why? Because to make the society tired and exhausting on searching for the truth. So at the end of the day, when you are reading like 10 conflicting narratives about what is happening in Lugar laboratory, you're just tired. Okay, whatever is going there, I'm just done. And this is basically what is a reference to the turtle and fox tale. If we are not searching for the truth, we're just removing our own shell to be eaten by the fox. And to move the shift to Georgia, the Kremlin tactics for the last couple of years is the following. They are investing a lot in the local language, not only in Georgia, but other countries as well. Why? Because of many reasons, some people might be skeptical for the content that is published in Russian. That's why something published in Georgian seems more trustworthy. That's why we're seeing many online outlets which are operating in Georgian, but they are financed by the Kremlin actors. Interestingly, one of the very dangerous and concerning trend in Georgia is the rise of far-right groups which are pro-Kremlin and connected to the Kremlin actors. This rise of the far-right groups have been happening for already last 2-3 years, I mean in online dimension. They are very well organized, they are operating in an effective way, and the result, I mean, many people are asking me like, what is the impact of the online disinformation? For example, if somebody reads a false news online, okay, it stays there. Like, no way. This online disinformation always have and impact and translation into offline space. And the clearest example of the online translated into offline was July 5, one of the darkest days in the history of Georgia, this July 2021, when mobs of far-right groups beat up to 53 journalists, and as a result, one of the journalists died. I will quickly stop at the far-right group Alt-Info, because it is one of the clearest examples how the pro-Kremlin actors are operating in Georgian online space. Let's take the example of far-right group Alt-Info. These guys have been there for already many years, but they become active online. It's been already 2 years. So first, they started operating via their online web pages, and then they moved to Facebook. And the interesting observation is Facebook remains the main platform for spreading disinformation in Georgia, because the majority of Georgians are connected to Facebook. They are getting their daily information and news on Facebook, so that's why these groups are choosing Facebook. And Alt-Info has been spreading anti-Western and pro-Kremlin narratives for many years, but nobody really took them seriously, because the take was that, okay, some guys are spreading some anti-Western disinformation and that's it. But the dangerous thing was that these guys were spreading anti-LGBT disinformation. And as you might know, the LGBTQ communities in Georgia are very targeted, and 90% of Georgian society is very conservative. Like for example, patriarch remains the #1 favorable person in Georgia. Church is #2 trusted institution after Georgian army. So this tells us a lot about Georgian society. So one of the sensitive topics for Georgians is religion and traditions. That somebody might target our religion and tradition. And of course, the Kremlin actors do know that these two topics are very sensitive, and they are trying to exploit these topics. They are trying to convince Georgian society that the West will come one day to Georgia and take the religion and traditions from Georgian society. Yes, of course, this sounds very funny, but these are the main narratives that has been planting on Georgian society for many years. And the result of these narratives was July 5, when the supporters of far-right groups went to Rustaveli Avenue and they beat up the journalists. These far-right groups, basically Alt-Info is operating in a very interesting way. The one domain is website, another domain is Facebook, and the shift that we are observing now is that they are also using Telegram channels, because Facebook took down their coordinated networks a couple of times. So that's why they are trying to first diversify their audiences to reach as many people as possible in Georgia, and the second, they are trying to move to more secured platform in order to not be targeted. And as you might know now, the Alt-Info is already a political party, which continues to spread its anti-Western and pro-Kremlin narratives, and nobody knows what will happen in Georgia one day if we will be able to observe another day of July 5. Another interesting thing about far-right is that it's not only Alt-Info, right? There are many groups and political parties who are far-right and pro-Kremlin. And two of the very interesting parties, basically Alliance of Patriots and Georgian March, they also have been operating in a very interesting way on Facebook. For example, the political party, which is openly pro-Russian, Alliance of Patriots, they have been conducting Facebook operations as well. Of course, they are the ones who are spreading anti-Western and pro-Russian narratives, but in a very interesting way. They are trying to portray, Alliance of Patriots and Georgian March, they have been trying to portray Turkey and Azerbaijan as the same threat to Georgia as Russia. It's a tactics of shifting our attention away from the real threat coming out of Russia and moving our attention towards Azerbaijan and Turkey. These political parties have been portraying these two countries as an enemies for Georgia. And as you might remember, Georgian March has organized 2 or 3 marches to the Azerbaijani border. It was a year or 2 ago, and basically it's another physical impact of online disinformation. And of course, I mean, these narratives did not go popular, but if time goes and they still continue to portray these two countries, basically 2 strategic partners of Georgia, as a threat, nobody really, we cannot make any prognosis what might happen. Another interesting observation, just to go back to Facebook. There is a Facebook-specific term, coordinated inauthentic behavior. This behavior means when groups of pages or people are working together to mislead others about who they are or what they are doing. So, for example, let's take a very easy, you see the Facebook group dedicated to music or movies. And when you join the group, you want to see the content which covers music or movies, right? And these groups are using this kind of titles to grow their audiences, to grow the members of the groups, and they under cover of these titles, they are spreading the political content. This is the coordinated inauthentic behavior. This is the basis on what Facebook removes these networks. Unfortunately, this behavior first became known to Georgian society back in 2019, when Facebook stated in their statement that a ruling party, Georgian Dream, was involved in coordinated inauthentic behavior and basically was spreading narratives which was artificially promoting Georgian Dream and which was artificially discrediting the opposition parties and journalists and pro-democracy activists. And then unfortunately this tactics was used by some other groups and parties as well in Georgia. But what is interesting is that these actors are becoming smarter. For example, if we take the first case of Georgian Dream being involved in coordinated inauthentic behavior, the tactics was that the party was outsourcing this activity to the local marketing company Panda, which was basically spreading misleading information in the name of Georgian Dream. And the aim was to first hide the traces because it's a very big reputational damage. And second was that basically some specific groups know how to do it best, right? And then when we saw other coordinated inauthentic behavior taking place on Georgian Facebook, they were more advanced. They were changing their tactics. For example, creating many pages, many groups to make it harder for us to search for them. But the good thing is that researchers like us at Atlantic Council, we have the exclusive partnership with Facebook, basically meaning that we're exchanging information with each other, and then Facebook removes this kind of networks. And last but not least, I want to touch upon the cyber domain, but Andrew will do it best. We are observing more and more information when cyber attacks and disinformation are crossing each other. For example, you might remember that in 2019 and then in 2020, Georgia saw 3 big cyber attacks on its national infrastructure. The first case was when a Georgian Ministry of Health and Lugar Lab were attacked, and we saw the leak of documents, and then some actors forged these documents to accuse Lugar Lab in doing some experiments on humans. Basically the same thing as in Operation Infection. The second case was very interesting one. One day when we woke up, we saw the information that the personal data of 4 million Georgians were available on the hacking forum, the rights forum. And it's a big shock, right? When you are a citizen of Georgia and all the information, like there was an article which was claiming that addresses, phone numbers, the ID numbers, and all kinds of personal data was just there for everybody, available for everybody. And it is the very first shock which makes the society vulnerable, because you feel this unsafety, you do not really feel secure, and you might think that everything might happen to me in this country. So this was a more influence operation targeted on breaking Georgian society from within. Then we, of course, checked these data and found out that there were not indicated ID numbers and the phone numbers, but of course there were the addresses and the names and surnames, etc., of Georgian citizens. Of course, this feeling of being targeted, being unsecure in the country makes society more and more vulnerable. And I will stop here, and maybe we will have chance to discuss the responses to how to deter disinformation, how to respond, and how to make society more resilient against this threat. Thank you.
Thank you, Eto, very much. I really liked your tale about turtle and the fox, the reality is that sometimes we are turtles and sometimes we are foxes. It is always changing. I mean Georgia and Georgian citizens, because we, as citizens, we are trolled by our government, and our government is trolled by others. Well, it is my observation, and it works very badly overall for the Georgian citizens. Yes, I hope that we will go more into the deep during our discussion period. Now I would like to invite Mr. Andro Godzillizer, the founder of Cybersecurity Studies and Education Center, who will elaborate a little more about cybersecurity and the role of Russia. Welcome, Mr. Godzillizer, welcome.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor to speak to you this afternoon, to speak to you today. Thank you for the kind introduction, Mr. Chairman, and the excellent speakers and the very good audience. Thank you very much once again. What is the geography of destructive cyber operations? Former Secretary Pompeo that Huawei and other Chinese state tech companies are Trojan horses for Chinese intelligence. Russia's disinformation campaigns try to turn our citizens against one another, and Iranian cyber attacks pledge Middle East computer networks. I have to be Russocentric today, and what I would like to share with you is a short overview of Russia's cyber activities. The issue is that Kremlin views the information as a key domain of modern military conflict, and in the last decade, cyber has become the fifth domain of confrontation. The cyber operations today are an important part of any war, conflict, or confrontation, and Russia is successfully developing its offensive cyber capabilities to achieve its political, economic, and military goals, as well as geopolitical advantage. How far will with what means and to what extent can Russia reach into global finance, energy markets, digital economy, communication, public services, or information systems, and from the use of malware such as NotPetya to SolarWinds or to Yandex and Kaspersky? What are the means of frustration? Can the Kremlin score an unexpected success in cyber war? We are insufficiently prepared, and when will we stop defining and start coping with the cyber challenges? These are the questions of today's. And we can see how Russian cyber power is becoming more and more sophisticated. Cyber attack against Estonia in 2007 was its political message, and the primitive operation for the bronze soldier aimed to provoke public unrest and mass disorder. This was the first attempt of using cyber to influence political processes. For the following year, in 2008, the use of cyber operations in the Russo-Georgia War was a well-organized complementary process to conventional military actions, aiming at creating an information vacuum, spreading disinformation, and clogging the channels of international support for Georgia. Later, in the war with Ukraine in 2014-16, Russia managed to utilize the capabilities of large telecommunication companies to secretly eavesdrop on their clients, determine their locations, and use this information to make psychological influence and to determine locations for military means, for artillery strikes. In addition, Russian intelligence services for the first time disabled part of the Ukrainian energy system by using sophisticated malware. Soon, Russia's destructive cyber activities went beyond the post-Soviet area, and Russian government-connected hackers, Russian intelligence services, targeted elections in Europe and the United States. We can argue that in recent years, Russian cyber-enabled influence operations has been aimed at attacking to state democratic institutions and the state sovereignty. One good example for this was extensive GRU organized cyber attack in 2019, when thousands of Georgian websites like government, courts, media, NGOs, and the TVs were defaced. Attackers replaced landing pages with electronic graffiti, and images of former President Mikhail Saakashvili were saying, "I will be back." The attack was massive but less sophisticated, and this could be an intelligence by attack strategy testing vulnerabilities, defenses, and resilience of our country before the parliamentary elections 2020. We must consider that even low-tech defacement could result quite high damage to weakly protected infrastructure. Several cyber attacks against Ukraine, including website defacement and destructive wiper malware, have made headlines last month as military tensions along the Russian-Ukrainian border have escalated. Impacted websites included the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry, the Ministry of Science, Ministry of Education, and other state services. The message, "Be afraid and expect the worst," was published, and even more additional malware was used to strike Ukrainian government websites, and it had some similarities to the well-known NotPetya Viper, but was more capable to make additional damage. Ladies and gentlemen, now let me talk about Russian cyber operations from Georgia's perspective. Russia's cyber operations, they continue to be the serious threats for Georgia. Therefore, securing the cyberspace for us is a priority. Compared to the cyber attacks of 2008, the level of Russian cyber threat has grown due to several factors. First is that Russia has not altered its aggressive cyber policy, but increased its offensive cyber capabilities even more. Second, Russia has been extended its cyber operations in both directions, information technical effect and, as mentioned, in information psychological field. And third, Georgia's dependence on ICT is much higher now, which increases the scale of the extended damage. Expected consequences of Russian destructive cyber operations can be diverse. For example, various levels of disruption of critical infrastructure, including ICS, which is industry control systems, cyber espionage, cyber attacks through sophisticated malware like black energy, like Robus, etc., supply chain compromising, and information psychological effect. On one hand, information technical effect could lead the country to the serious damage and or casualties And on the second hand, the propaganda spreads through cyber channels could cause the alteration of public perceptions in favor of the Kremlin, reduce our pro-Western sentiments, and form or strengthen pro-Russian elite, and this may appear as a reason of possible conventional actions, possible military activities from Russian side. Let me a little bit conclude with the suggestions and recommendations what Georgia and what country, what small country can and should do to ensure resilience against the cyber threats. After recent developments, the White Washington is going to invite allies like UK, Denmark, Estonia, and France to the annual exercise organized by US Department of Defense, by DoD. And according to official information, the exercise will build the community of cybersecurity operators and enhance capabilities in terms of detecting malicious actions against critical infrastructure and synchronizing countermeasures and joint responses. It is a conception of a collective defense alliance in cyberspace, which will act in accordance with the norms of responsible behavior of states in cyberspace. Engagement in these events is very important for Georgia, as its cyberspace is a kind of testing ground, kind of polygon for Russian cyber operations. In 2019, the US and maybe 26 partner states signed a joint statement on the responsible behavior of states in cyberspace, and the partners know that if necessary, they will act jointly against the responsible countries in accordance with the norms of international law. It is not surprise that Russia have not signed the document, and it is important for Georgia to adhere to this document and participate in the development of a framework of responsible behavior in the internet, as well as in cyber capacity building activities. At the same time, Georgia should not limit itself to statements of or attribution, and at the outset should express its readiness to join the Cyber Flag Alliance or Cyber Flag exercise. And these developments seem real, given to degree of Georgia's cooperation with the West in the cyberspace, with NATO and with allied countries. So, first, Georgia should integrate cybersecurity into wider security field. The second, to make amendment in acquisition legislation which will ensure banning the ICT production or ICT technologies made in adversarial states, particularly in Russia. It's important to enhance public-private partnership, which will include engagement of cyber intellect from business sector into cyber defense and development information sharing platform between public and private sectors, and to encourage public-private partnerships, PPP platforms. And fourth is establish volunteer-based cyber units, cyber defense units, and organize joint governmental cyber exercises with volunteer-based cyber defense units. Excellencies, my final point I would like to make, this is about wine. You would agree, everybody or most people like Georgian wine, and 15 years ago, Russia banned our wine for political reasons. This was a hybrid activity, economic blockade. This action led Georgian winemakers to improve their wine and to reach world's wine markets. And the same is here. To respond Russian possible cyber attacks, we will do and we further improve our cybersecurity. We have to further improve our cybersecurity, our resilience, and I personally do believe that Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin was and will remember Mephistopheles' phrase that I am part of the power which eternally wills evil and eternally works good. Thank you very much for your attention, and I am ready for your question. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Mr. Godzillizer. It is always a pleasure to listen to you because we are picking up so many new ideas which might be applicable for the society and for the country overall. Yes, cybersecurity must be taken into the wider security agenda, and unfortunately we don't see any signs of it because we see that any of the Georgian private company or a governmental entity is open to be under the attack, under the cyber attack, and it is very easily solvable for the identified or unidentified actors. And also cyber units and their exercising is of course very important, but the only thing that stands behind this is a political will. And our political will is to use all these utilities just in favor to their personal interests, and it's not getting out from the overall interest of Georgia as a country. And thank you very much for your recommendations because they are really valuable and they are really very important to be implemented, and hopefully someone in the government of Georgia will take them really very carefully. And it is not only a recipe for Georgia, but for the rest of the countries who are experiencing such threat and such challenge from the cyber area. We will come back to you during our questions and answers period. And now I would like to ask Mr. Roger Gent, the correspondent of Le Figaro, Radio France, author of many books, to talk about his own experience and to share his knowledge with us. Thank you for coming here. Just push the button.
Thank you very much, Konstantin. Good morning or good afternoon already. Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be with you and to have the opportunity to talk to you. I need to talk a bit about my experience. I came in Georgia 20 years ago and covered most of the events in the whole region, Central Asia, Russia, and so on. And one of the things which came to me indeed by itself, and then I managed to read books on that, is that Russia is a poor power. And I will come back to that point, which for me is crucial. I will try to take these things from the other side, I would say, if I may. I will start with and to respond to what Eto was speaking about the hidden trace. I will speak about the non-hidden trace. You will see. On 14th of September last year, Le Monde, the French daily newspaper, wrote a piece. It was Benoît Wittkind, my friend from the Moscow correspondent, about a small kind of NGO named FBI. In Russian, FBR. I will come back to that because Mr. Prigozhin has a lot of humor, you know. And it was because there were some very third zones, fourth, very small websites and so on, which received some letter from this FBI NGO. This NGO pretend to make some advocacy for police violence in the West. In the US, there are a lot of police violence. In France, there are 2 cases that they were advocating, and so on and so on. And the journalist from Le Monde was alerted on that and tried to dig in. And just look at the website of FBR, which means Fond Barbis Repressiami. But in Russian, it's the FBI, yeah? And if you scroll down, and it was written in the article of my colleague, you just scroll down on the website, it's www.fbr.ru, and you will see that you can read that the FBI is a non-profit organization founded with the help of the Russian businessman Yevgeny Prigozhin. No. Yes, you see the trace is not hidden. So, but for me, what is important in this is that it is not hiding. Usually, if you work on influence, precisely you try to hide the trace. And all kind of influence, I did some investigation, for example, on the history and the present of separatism. Precisely what you do is you try to make a people uprising or look like a people uprising. The first, I think in the history of Russia or Soviet Union, examples of separatism was in 1923. 1923-24, in Tatar Bunar and somewhere in Belarus now. And for example, in Belarus, the guys from the Cheka, or GPU at the time, they were dressed as a peasant from Belarus. They went on the other side of the border, pretend to make a kind of people's uprising, and then took this territory. So something we know. But in this case, Mr. Prigozhin is not hiding the traces. And for me, it's really important. There is maybe two reasons. If you look at the sociology of the ruling circles in Russia, it's probably a way for him to show to the big master that he's doing things for the state or for the regime, and we should never ignore that. I was recently in Berlin, and I found out that the Yakunin's Dialogue of Civilization organization is closing down. And if you speak with people in Berlin, they say, you know, this think tank or so-called didn't do much during many years. And I saw that maybe one of the reasons is just Yakunin wanted to show to Putin that he's, okay, he took a lot of money for himself, but he's giving back a bit to help the regime. So he doesn't care about the result as well. But for example, for me, the other reason why Mr. Prigozhin acts so openly with this FBI NGO is also that the most important for him, and maybe for the Russian regime, not the most important, it is as well important, is to show that you can influence the situation. Because this is a poor power. And this is precisely a tool of a poor power. I think it was said on the previous panel. But for me, this question is really important, and not only for me. Maybe some of you read this summer, there was a good piece from Peter Krekor. Peter Krekor is a political scientist and is director of a think tank based in Budapest. And precisely this is what he was underlying. He doesn't, and as me, he doesn't pretend that the influence does not exist. He doesn't pretend that it is not important and can have an impact, as you Eto showed and others. But one of the goals, at least, of China and Russia, and this is what Peter Krekor was writing about, is to show that you can be influential. And look at what's going on since a month now about Ukraine. Maybe the most important is not to reach an agreement, it's just to show that you talk, that Russia talks with Washington. Like you feel if you read the headlines of the mainstream media of all over the world, that the two big powers of the world are Russia and US. I went this morning to look, for example, at the IMF ranking of the GDP, country per GDP, the ranking. So the first is US, $26 trillion. Second, China, 16 trillion. Then 10 times less is Russia, 1.6, 11th position. So the real, I mean, GDP is not everything, but in terms of economy at least, and this is what you need, I mean, the power first is in the money, or at least is, you can't be a power without the money, but if you show that you are bigger than you are, and this is all the point, but Russia is 1.6, after South Korea, after Canada, after Italy, France, India, and so on. So I think this is really important to get this in mind. And why it is important, in my opinion, and here I speak as a specialist of this area, but also as a citizen, is also that if we think in terms of risk, in terms of security, of course it's crucial to not underestimate the risk, the danger, of course, but it's also crucial to not overestimate it. I think because this is why you make the mistake, this is why you don't understand the things, the real dynamics of the things and so on. So this is why it is important to keep this in mind, and this is important as citizen, this is important as if you are acting the countermeasures against influence, also to get this in mind. This is the way also we can be resilient, I would say, again, as citizens, as activists. It is very concrete, I would say, because it's also a way to look at ourselves. What are the weaknesses of our countries? And where Russia is playing often, if you look into the details, they would not try to influence the whole society, but they will target one segment of it. And by the way, they are very good at that, and they were very good much before the algorithm. In the 60s in the US, they were targeting less than 1% of the population. Some, for example, some circles with people active in the black minorities movements, for example, or in Germany with the peaceful movement. And just with that, it was enough to get some leverage. This may be what happened in 2017 in Germany with the AfD, because and there was very good research made on that, one at least. Russia was just targeting the 3 or 4 million Russian speakers in Germany, over like 73 million people or 80 million people. So they were targeting that, and maybe they managing to reach some crucial threshold, which helped to put AfD in the parliament. But the roots of AfD are not, it's not Germany, it's not Russia, it's in the German society, what's going on in the society. Same for the US, I mean, if Trump was elected, if this illiberal, let's say, power came to lead Russia for the US for 4 years, it was first an American question. So this is where I feel when we fight against the influence of Russia, of China, and so on, of an external power, we should always see that look at in our societies, in our behavior, what's wrong also. Just also to be very concrete, it is the best way to address something, because look at the anti-vax movement at the time. Of course, if you look at RT, for example, Russia Today in France, for example, they are permanently targeting this, helping this movement, giving them a big audience. You can explain them, and we have all the evidences, of course, that 95% or more of the people which are now in reanimation in hospitals were not vaccinated, but the anti-vax would not believe them. So as we say in French, you can't make a donkey not drinking if he doesn't want to drink. So, because the reason why the anti-vax is behaving this way is elsewhere. It's not in the truth or not, but maybe there is something indeed wrong, like in the trust in the institutions, and so on and so on. So this is where we have to address it. And this is why I think that looking in ourselves, understanding, and not, of course, we have to focus on the external influence, but you have to see also what we can do from inside our society to be more resilient, and also to target better the message. You can do some fact checking on about COVID and who is in the reanimation in the hospitals. I mean, you can show that 2 + 2 make 4. This is not what they want to hear. So the problem is elsewhere. So this is why it is so crucial for me to get this in mind. I'm a really professional journalist, so I'm looking at RT for weeks and weeks sometimes, and I wish this to no one to. And when you look at, I guess you did also RT in English. In French, for example, they are not really original, you know, they just use everything. They know that, for example, in France, you can have, you had the Gilets jaunes movement, which was about, probably deeply, it was, of course, it was a question of the price of energy, but also it showed some breaks within the French society. When Macron was elected 5 years ago, there was the debate was about who benefits from the globalization in France, for example, the big cities, Paris, I mean, 5, 10 big cities, and the ones which are not benefiting from it. And by the way, this region, these small cities are emptied slowly by slowly. And Russian, they got this. They understood that the debate was around that, and probably there was some truth in it. And for example, they just create a new program which is all about that. They just go in some small city of 50,000 or 100,000 inhabitants. They just meet the people. They look like not political at all. They just give them the floor. They explain their life and so on. They complain. But precisely they are trying to use what worked 7 years ago. And if once something is popping up, like in the headlines, like a migration issue, as it was in Germany in 2017, remember the Lisa fake story, for example, they just use it. And let's see what will happen in France now. The election will be in 2 months, 3 months. But I would not be surprised that probably there will be nothing, but that they could use if at some point there is a scandal on immigration or something like this, they will use it, and then they will try to, as they did with the COVID, for example. But the response was quite good. So there is nothing to do on this. So this is what I wanted to say. Look at, I took my Bible, which is Thucydides, the war on Peloponnes. You see, it's a big book. Because, I mean, that book is 2,500 years old. I guess most of you read it. I try to read it every 5 years. It's a wonderful book to understand what is the fight between a democracy, whatever, if Athens was not exactly what our democracies are, but there are a lot of similarities, and the holist power, which is Sparta. And we can really compare, and I know that some American academic did some comparison with what we live now and so on. And in this 600 or 700 pages, it almost never criticized Sparta. He speaks about Athens, while this guy was obviously defending Athens till the end, but also he saw that the mistakes which were made by Athens, because of the hubris, which is one of the most important concepts of political science, very difficult to use, but precisely because he wanted to understand what were the mistakes which were made by Athens, which led to the victory. And of course, when we see how the democracy nowadays are really suffering, it's important to read that, to be optimist. Finally, Sparta won, but after 30 years, they could not stand, and they lost again. Thank you very much.
Mr. Center, thank you very much. It was really interesting overview of your experience and of your knowledge. Yes, it is really difficult to stop other actors to want us to be manipulated, because those other actors are known knowns, they are unknown knowns, they are unknown unknowns. So what should we do to protect ourselves? Is there a state responsibility that state has to make some steps to protect its own citizens from being thunderbolted by this false information or some other interferences like taking personal information, or we personally should be taught, trained somehow to protect our own information and to protect our own area of having reliable information. Yes, now we have to go to the to discuss more detailed issues, and let's continue the tradition. I will pick up the first question from online users, and this question goes to Dr. Kovalcikova. Does EU consider its vulnerability caused by unwillingness of some of its member state government to counter aggressive Russian info warfare and disinformation, allowing by that liberal forces across Europe and benefit from this particular member to acquire false information and spread it across the Atlantic society, a kind of creeping disinformation? So maybe you give us your comment about this question, and if there are any other questions in the audience, please let me know and I will make an order. Okay.
Thank you for this question. As you mentioned in the beginning, whose responsibility is to protect ourselves against the spread of manipulated information, distorted messaging? Is it the states? Is it the citizens? And I will maybe respond from this angle. Yesterday, I was discussing on a panel about cyber activism, discussing the roles of elves fighting the pro-Kremlin trolls, and how these chapters of elves have been created and exist and do that countering of the disinformation, of the trolling across different countries. In Europe, there have been 13 chapters, so in 13 EU member states identified that. They're doing this in their free time. Most of them, I think, they are unpaid, which is the opposite of the trolls, who are paid, targeted groups to really interfere into the public spheres. So yes, you see that there is this mobilization of the citizens that feel vulnerable, that are vulnerable to this messaging, to this influence, and are mobilizing. Of course, not everyone can do that. It's great to have elves that they are doing it, and there are more of them. They're growing. There have been 3 EUISS academies training these EUISS across different countries. So these initiatives, these grassroots initiatives are important. They are, of course, just one part of the initiatives, of the activities that we need in order to be effective and have a meaningful and sustainable impact on countering disinformation. Now, this has to be complemented, to say the least, beyond other activities with the state efforts, with the efforts of the institutions, of international organizations, to, of course, build more institutionalized mechanisms with more resources, which are coordinated across different countries, as none of these efforts of either coming from Russia or other actors are only impacting one country at a time. These are very much interconnected threats that are impacting and undermining democracies, the security of the countries, of the societies, of different groups, marginalized groups. We have heard also what happened during July the 5th in Georgia, but in many other countries where the journalists are under the threat, where citizens, where the freedom of speech, as I mentioned also in my remarks, the suppression of information is also part of these information manipulation operations. And so we really need to ensure that if we are in our alliances of partners of democracies, that there is a common understanding that there is a need to protect the democratic values while countering the distorted or false or manipulated information. And I think within the European Union, the understanding, of course, is there. I also think the understanding is across the allies of NATO, that what is important to preserve and protect and defend are the democratic values and securities of the member states, and of course of the partners and of these principles writ large. So there are, as I mentioned, quite a few efforts that are already ongoing, that are financed from the EU common budget, that are increasing these efforts and the tools and the resources to counter disinformation. And I think this is important to underline that there is this common push. And even though if there might be different actors and different dynamics, I think that it's in the interest of all the democracies to really move forward and cooperate on this while protecting the democratic principles of the freedom of speech at the same time.
Thank you, Nad'a, so much. Now I would like to ask Ms. Ioseliani, our founder, to raise a question.
But is it possible to have a question to Mrs. Kolobina? No? She's not there. Kolobina. Ara? Oh, that's a pity. Well, okay. But then to the others. I just evil is always much more creative, faster, much more efficient, and good is frequently left behind. And what is the reason in this sphere? Is it higher salaries, much better prepared professionals? High salaries, or maybe something else, and how to prevent all that. Thank you. To everyone.
I will pick up on some points that René said. And I do agree that there are covert and overt operations which are led by the Kremlin, but let me not agree with you with the overestimating. Because as you mentioned, the Prigozhin case, like it was obvious that he was the one who was standing behind the website, right? But there were many cases, for example, that Prigozhin and his troll factory interfered in the election of the US, which the US intelligence community reported 2 years after the interference. Or that, for example, Prigozhin is standing behind the Russian private military company Wagner. It's not that much, I mean, it's not that much obvious, right? He's not the one who's saying that, yeah, these are my guys who are fighting in Africa, Ukraine, Latin America, etc., etc. So we should not really call it overestimation. And another thing is that we are not demonizing Russia or China. Of course, there are some messages that are invented by Russia, but in majority cases, the Kremlin is trying to exploit already sensitive topics that are in the society. So these societies are vulnerable on some topics, and the malign and bad actors are just exploiting them to fuel more and more negative emotions. And of course, naming and shaming is one of the first responses. For example, as was done in the Prigozhin case, when he was named, that he was the one who was interfering in elections and he was sanctioned, and not only him, but others as well. And here we come with the topic of cooperation of three sectors, NGO sector, media, and the government. Without the role of the government, who should be the part of the solution, not the part of the problem, it is difficult to make responses to disinformation actors. For example, let's take the case of Georgia, the Alliance of Patriots, the political party. It was Estonian intelligence service who wrote openly, it was the Dossier Center, an organization who provided the documents how Alliance of Patriots is connected to Russia. Or in the case of Georgia in March, it was the Estonian intelligence service and their report who said that these guys are financed by Russia. So this should be done in Georgia by official agencies of Georgia. And okay, if it's not done, then if these reports are already out, somebody should be looking into them and investigating if there is a real foreign interference in elections and if there is an attempt to break Georgian society from within. Because if there is a murder, there should be a murderer, right? Somebody who committed the murder. The same thing is on disinformation. If there is an attempt to break society from within, if there is an attempt to interfere in elections, there should be somebody doing it, right? And clearly naming the actors is the crucial. And of course, there are many reports produced by us, by other researchers, of course with open sources, who are making estimations that these actors might be behind them, and then comes the role of the official agencies who should be taking care of that. Regarding the legislation, I'm not really convinced of having some legislation regulating disinformation in Georgia because of Georgia being fragile democracy, and this legislation might be misused in the country. But there are long-term efforts that can be done in Georgia. For example, the Finland case, when the critical thinking subject was introduced in Finnish schools, and I think this was done in other Nordic countries as well. And the second and very important one, to realize that the disinformation is a national security issue. Especially when it comes to the foreign actors who are trying to interfere in the domestic actions. We should be taking information domain as the domains of land, sea, and air, where the warfare is taking. The same thing should be applied for the information domain. And I think I will stop here.
Is anybody willing to answer the same question, or we can go to another question? All right, then we have one more question.
Just I agree with what you said. My point is the same. About the salaries or what the means, the problem of, I see that with France, for example, is that our societies, our leaderships are very divided, in fact. So you can put a lot of money, but that's not the point. The point is that we are so divided that even Macron, for example, who is president, who is obviously absolutely pro-Western, pro-European, and so on, but I see that his message is quite mixed because in the elites, in the Ministry of Defense, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs a bit, and so on, we have a lot of people who don't like America, who are against NATO, and so on. So he has to take this into account. And this is, for me, and this is the same in Germany, it's very clear in Germany as well. So this is the real problem, because then we are unable to answer. The answer is never good. The energy to fight against these messages is not there. Plus, the other problem is, of course, that it's not a problem, but we are democracies and it has its weak side. For example, we speak about, I mean, in part of the French opinion, for example, Russia looks at the great power, look how powerful they are. And if we want to fight against that, you would say no, and it doesn't work. I feel sometimes we should not be, but it's not the role of a journalist, but just be tough and I would say unfair. You just say, look at the level of pension in Russia. It's 180 euros a month. Do you want this? In France, you know, the pension is like minimum 1,000, 1,200. So, I mean, we have to be unfair, otherwise you can speak, but it never produces any result, I feel.
Thank you very much. Now we can go to another question in the audience.
My name is Leila Kiknadze, University of Georgia. My question is concerning the misinformation or the false truths that you have mentioned that some certain groups like Altinfo and others, they use the cyberspace for spreading their narrative or interpretation of the event that is happening, and they have their target audience. But my question is concerning that audience. Is there any observation that you have observed how those people choose their truth and what tools they choose to distinguish, for example, the false truth from the truth, and what are the reasons or factors that make them to be tended to that particular narrative or interpretation? Thank you.
I think we have to apply to our online speakers. Mr. Godzillizer, maybe you are willing to answer?
Yes, sure. Thank you very much for this question. The content itself, this information content, this is represents a mix of false and true information aimed at confusing, demoralizing, and gaining influence over the target audience. And the target audience is the first of all population of Russia and certain groups within the population of other countries, for Georgia and for Western societies, the internal Russian political elite or those of the target countries, and the channels of spreading propaganda are very various, including TV shows and other radio channels, bots and social media trolls, optimized search engines, etc., etc. The Russian propaganda, according to the data of leading partner intelligence services, by using the aforementioned channels and spreading the content, the Russian propaganda is mainly trying to promote several ideas in several groups. First of all, the first idea of Russian propaganda is that the bankrupt Western liberal order must be changed with a Eurasian neoconservative post-liberal world order, which protects traditions, as Eto mentioned, conservative values and through freedoms. So this is a main narrative on Russian propaganda, for example, for Georgian and pro-Western states, which are more conservative, which are more like traditional societies, conservative societies. The second is that the West is demonizing Russia, whilst the latter is merely trying to protect its interests and sovereignty. And the third, I think, is that the United States and the West are interfering with the democratic politics of sovereign states and changes government all over the world. As I can say, the hybrid warfare and Russian propaganda is what Russia means that the West makes with Russia. They are concentrating in these three content, and as mentioned, the audience is very various. And first of all, the Russian society and Russian citizens to make longer Putin's regime, Kremlin's regime, to influence Russian society, Russian people, and to make sure that they don't have problems in in their own society.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zent.
That's a very good question, and I spend a lot of time trying to understand how they manage to target so so perfectly sometimes our societies. And as I said, they did it much before the algorithm, because in the 60s they were able to touch very small segment, for example, of the American or the German society, and still with this 1% segment of 1% of the whole population, let's say, they managed to get something from that. I think Mr. Godzillizer touched a very important point. He said the first target is the Russian population, let's say. And I think because they just, and they speak also to instinct, because the way that the Russian leadership, for example, is seeing its own people, it's not a very nice way. It's quite, I mean, they are really seen as people which have no value, and this is an elite who knows, like the people from the KGB, they call themselves the experts sometimes. We know, the people don't know. We don't have to listen to them. We know what is good for them, which is, by the way, the definition of the tyranny or the despotism from Kant. He says this is when I know for you what is good for you. But I think this is very important, and they speak to instinct, and the instinct that they talk to in Russia, they're also in France, they're also in Georgia, they're also in the US, in Germany, and so on. And for example, now people are comparing sometimes the tools used by China and the tools used by Russia, and that's not exactly the same. They don't use the same methodology, and Russia is much better also than China did. I will not go into details, but just to show that Russia is much better, and China is more on the way to defend and to try to promote their own system. Let's say they change now after the COVID. While Russia would more use a negative soft power to say, for example, in Georgia they have nothing to sell to the Georgian population. So what they say to Georgia, say, look, as the West is bad. This is the Alliance of Patriots is doing this every day, for example. The tools are the very old ones. Also, this is, when you look at the history, I read a book from a French philosopher which was Russian origin, and like in the 1920s, he wrote a book about the Russian ID nationalism in the 19th century. And I read this book like 10 years ago, and it was amazing how the vocabulary didn't change. They spoke about the decadence of the Europe, for example. The same wording that we have today, exactly the same. So this is also part of the power of Russia, because they know their tools and they are using exactly the same than 100 years ago. And sometimes they mistake, because they just try to target our societies as they would speak to their own societies. So 2017, elections in France, there was this rumor, I think it's not true and whatever, we don't care, that Macron is homosexual. Can you imagine? So they wanted, and even I know some Russian politologists or Pierre Shiki who came to France and tried, and I saw them on Facebook, they were writing about, look, Macron is homosexual, so probably has a very little chance to win, and so on. And they didn't know that now in French society, since 15 or 20 years, this is not an issue. We're ready to, I mean, we really don't care. We care about who is creating jobs, but having an homosexual in l'Élysée is not an issue.
Thank you very much. We can go for another question to audience.
Thanks, Konstantin. And thank you, panel. It was very interesting. One of the things I wanted to ask is somebody who's working in this area. So everything you've said is in the literature. We've talked about methods, tactics, what the Russians are doing. What I'm interested in is I'm building a course and we're looking at resiliency. We know that we only have so much time. Each government ministry, each staff has only so much time. How effective, so we talk about measures of performance, X amount of messaging, X amount of tools used, X amount of this, but I've not seen much research on behavioral changes, because I'm interested in, if I'm going to spend time on something, if it has an effect. So a measure of performance is putting things out. A measure of effect is, how did it change behavior? So my question is, how can we measure, or how have we seen behavior changed as a result of a disinformation campaign from Russia or from somewhere else, Russia, China? What have we seen change? Because if it's not changing, we all know it's a threat, we've all said it's a threat, and we all know what they're doing. Unless it's having an impact, maybe we should focus our attention elsewhere. Thank you.
Very challenging question, I would say.
In 2 words, I would say, if you look at what happened in France with the COVID, I will not exactly answer to your question. I'm not, but look at the COVID, for example. If you look at Russia Today, Sputnik, like a year ago, they were just speaking about COVID, and they were telling everything and its opposite. For example, they were saying how the vaccination is not working and is dangerous, and then they were showing exactly the opposite. Whatever they were trying to. And first, I'm not sure that France answered to that, but the only answer that Macron did, and not because of Russia, he's just a politician in charge, is just put a lot of money. He paid, for example, if you go in Paris, every restaurant is very happy because everyone got thousands of euros. We had a big debt, but that's another issue. And it just made the population happy. So now if you make a survey in France about COVID, you would see that most of the population think that the government did its job, and the disinformation from China, from Russia is just vanished. It costs few billions of euros indeed.
Sorry, can I add something? Zurab Kudalashvili, media consultant. Answer for your question, because your publications, which one I mentioned, our speakers, including how they changed behavior, I mean, Russian side or Chinese side, they changes, how I know, because of these publications, which one you publishing. I mean, what Moscow doing, what doing, how doing, with whom, and which tools they're using, you publishing, and Moscow correcting own behavior. Thank you very much. Second, I have a question. Online and offline operations, which one mentioned, do you following and do we have answers for defend ourselves? I mean, Europe or Georgia or UK, where I'm from, do we have solutions what to do and not only measure what Moscow doing? Thank you very much.
Yeah, so we're talking about the measuring of impact. This is not something we're doing because we are researching open source, but there are some clear cases. For example, let's take the case of Germany. When Germany and not only the European countries were facing the migrant crisis back in 2016, 2017, and René mentioned the Lisa case, which was basically when, for those who know, 30-year-old half Russian, half German girl went missing, and then she comes back next day and she says that she was kidnapped by 3 Arab origin men. It's her quote. And then what happened after was that all the newspapers in Germany and not only exploded with this case, they all started criticizing Merkel and her government for letting in migrants and all this migrant policy. And then it took 2 weeks for German police to investigate the case, and it appeared that she was not kidnapped, but she spent the day and night with her boyfriend. And this was actual impact. There was a big correlation between what was online, what was surfacing online, criticizing Merkel and the migrant crisis, and what happened in an offline space. How people went outside, and in many German towns and cities, we saw the big protests against the migration policy. And this was the direct translation of an online into offline. And the case that I mentioned in Georgia of July 5, when all this messaging saw the translation into offline space. But it is the joint work of many many experts of different fields, us researchers, psychologists, and the polling organizations to work directly with people and ask how their behavior has changed. It might also be the results of elections, like how the percentages of the parties are changing. If, for example, if we are seeing more and more pro-Russian messaging in Georgia, if the pro-Western parties are losing the support, yes. Yeah, this is something that we should be looking. I mean, it is a joint effort of many experts of many fields. And just, for example, the Georgia's Georgian people supporting Euro-Atlantic aspirations. As you might know, the percentage is really high, like 80%, but it should be measured in the time frame. But it should also not be so late. For example, the 80% of Georgians are supporting the membership in EU and NATO, but we do not really know if it's an informed choice. We know that they are hearing it on a daily basis that EU and NATO is good, but we don't know if they know why it's good. So if there is an information vacuum, the emotional messages framed in the Kremlin will be filling that space, that information vacuum in the long-term perspective. And of course, we're not talking about tanks and bullets that have the direct effect, right? We're talking about long-term effort of making society remove its own shell.
If there is anybody online who would like to answer to these two questions. Nad'a? Okay.
Maybe just briefly, because a lot of the points were also mentioned already, and they were very valid and important. Just to follow up on what Ethel just mentioned about information vacuum. So the question was, what can we do about it? Do we know what to do about it? Do we have the tools? I think just first, we already passed the phase that now we know what we are facing much better than we knew before, because the new tools, especially with technology, have been used much more commonly by now, and we have been much more aware by also the systems and cooperation with social media companies where it spreads a lot, and it's mostly about the amplification, dissemination, and the reach of these messages. Because in democracies, it's very hard, as the earlier question was there, identify exact truth and the fault. We do have facts, and then if it's really false in terms of the facts, it's possible to identify based on open sources that exist, and that's what people just do the fact-checking and the debunking in that way. But most and a lot of this information manipulation is actually just information that is mixed, as Mr. Godzillizer mentioned. It's false and true together, but it's taken out of the context, or it's reusing certain narratives that have been used before. So already having the list of the narratives that we have also mentioned during the session helps identify that, you know, it triggers the same emotion, you see the same type of a narrative, and that's one way to, for example, address it. But how do we fill this information vacuum that Eto just was talking about, that is exploited by the malign actors that are interfering into the public spheres and undermining and decreasing the credibility of the actors? Well, how do we do that? Well, one of the ways is exactly the strategic communications effort, this more proactive strategic communication. So to make sure that the information is available, is clear, is simple, is factual, and is regular. So people don't feel like they're missing some information, that something is hidden from them, that they don't know where to find it, that it's too complicated. And I think understanding these needs is the way forward to make sure that the targeted information is addressing these needs in a way that the citizens, the users have enough information and therefore are better prepared and resilient when they are encountering information that is potentially misleading, false, or out of context. So this is something that we do know is important. Obviously, the way is how to do that, how to make sure that we communicate in the right time, in the right way, with the right messaging to the right target audiences. And that's also the combination, not only the words, but also learning from the other actors in a way. How do they use humor? How do they use images? How do they use different sounds, different triggering of emotions? And there is a lot of research on that also from the behavioral science, this triggering of emotions, positive emotions, sad, doubtful, negative, all kinds of elements that work there that is possible to also use in a very active and I would say democratic way as well, not undermining our own principles, but actually using the tools that are available just in the right way.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank all of our panelists for very interesting conversation, because we discussed absolutely everything that is touching us and our countries on a daily basis. Manipulation, attacks on critical infrastructure, lack of political will, and also some questions how we should defend ourselves from the coming challenges and coming threats. And this is really important that we are able to identify how to position ourselves in these circumstances, and we see that there are some new strategies and new works, academic works to manage this situation. Just because we are running out of time, we have to stop our panel here. Otherwise, it would be really interesting to continue it for a longer time. And once again, I would like to ask to thank all of you for this very interesting and comprehensive involvement in our panel. Thank you very much.